Hi, welcome to Module 4 of the 6-week online trauma training. Now, Module 4 will be divided into 3 sections, Section A, Section B, and Section C. This week, though, we will not have required outside videos, so you'll have plenty of time to really go through this module and learn what we're trying to emphasize. And we begin with the core competency that teaches clients the role that perceived threat and the autonomic nervous system play in the development and continuation of PTSD symptoms. So my first question is, what makes an event traumatic? And of course, the answer is nothing to do with the event per se. It's the perception of the event that makes it traumatic. So here, this woman looks on the verge of being traumatized, and this kid, of course, doesn't look traumatized at all. I don't know if I'd let my son do that, but anyway, he looks to be fairly happy and well-adjusted with his little pet. And this is one of my favorite photos. This is a Guam brown snake, which is not venomous, but it's in someone's toilet bowl. So if you should visit Guam, you might want to look down first. So my second question, and this is not a trick question, but it's a question that I think you need to listen to very carefully. So right now, wherever you are, whatever you're really doing, unless you're doing dangerous physical work, as it pertains to physical safety, are you 100% safe? When I ask this question in live trainings, about 50% of the people say no, they do not feel physically safe. My response is usually, well, why aren't you safe? I'm looking around. Nothing's happening. Something might happen in a minute. That changes that answer. But right now, you're 100% safe. If, for example, smoke began oozing through the cracks in the wall, you would probably not be safe. If somebody ran into the room with a mask and an automatic weapon, you probably wouldn't be safe. I'm not sure this is pretty smart. But generally speaking, unless there is an actual perceivable threat, mostly the answer should be yes, you are 100% safe. The reason I ask this particular question is, let me come back here, is because what it emphasizes is the inability of people who have been traumatized, people with PTSD, to really differentiate am safe from feel safe. If my question was right now, as it pertains to physical safety, do you feel 100% safe? How do I know what you feel? 100% can say yes or no. I might say yes or no. So it has to do with the perception of safety, but also it has to do with an organ inside your brain called the anterior cingulate cortex. It's sort of attached to the corpus callosum, and it's part of a system that interacts with the environment to determine whether there's a safety or danger in the environment. So if you look at my little chart here, this is the anterior cingulate, and of course one of the places it connects to is the amygdala, and one of the main functions of the amygdala deals with the fear circuitry that we have. So people with a compromised anterior cingulate, let's call it the ACC, have trouble feeling safe no matter what the situation is. One of the questions that I ask is, I call it my garage example, is I first ask if anybody's been a victim of crime in a parking garage. Most people have not. And then I say, well, on Thursdays when I'm in town, I have an appointment downtown. I drive into a garage, I park at street level, I look out, I can see traffic, I can see people walking, but also there are people inside the garage. Since I live in Florida, many of the people I see are senior citizens. But the odds of anybody being attacked or being mugged by a senior citizen is nil. And then I go in, I have my appointment, I come out an hour later, and as I leave the building and walk into the garage towards my car, I look over my left shoulder, I look over my right shoulder, and get in and drive away. I then ask How many people do the same thing, look over their shoulder, check for danger, and almost everybody raises their hand, even though I mentioned to them, most of us have never been victims of crime. I've never been a victim of crime. But I am a member of this society, and in our society, I believe all of us have learned that parking garages are dangerous places, or potentially dangerous places. So even though I've not been a victim of crime, I've seen the 6 o'clock news. I know that they can be dangerous. I've seen movies with Jason Bourne racing through the parking garage at 90 miles an hour. They can be dangerous places. And so it's been conditioned, the ACC has been conditioned to see parking garages as dangerous places. And what I feel happens is this: if this is the size and volume of the anterior cingulate of a person who's not traumatized, this might be the size and volume of the anterior cingulate of somebody who is. If it is not at full volume, I think its ability to actually determine safety is compromised. One of the things that's now showing up in the literature, in particular with those veterans who served in Afghanistan, is their response to these black plastic garbage bags. Because very often in Afghanistan, these explosive devices were hidden inside these black bags. One trial learning, if you see it explode, if a friend of yours is injured, you have conditioned now a fear of black plastic garbage bags. And I think what happens then is every time you see it, the amygdala shrinks. It's not capable of actually perusing the environment and determining safety. So my next question: can the human brain distinguish between physical and psychological danger? And the answer is no. It doesn't distinguish physical from psychological, it just determines danger. So I live in Southwest Florida. I live on a large preserve. It's beautiful, so I bought the house. My wife's a bird watcher. And every once in a while, on a Sunday morning, perhaps on a nice morning, I'll take a walk around the preserve. Several Sundays ago, I was walking around the preserve, beautiful, beautiful day, sipping my coffee, and all of a sudden, 10 feet in front, coiled in front of me, is a snake. And without thinking, without doing anything, I jump back because I don't want to get bitten. But then I look and I see it wasn't a snake at all. It was actually a coiled up piece of wire. And I know that's an experience that almost everybody here has experienced at one point or another. So I look around to make sure nobody sees me, and then I kind of laugh and I walk on. But that is a very, very primitive survival reaction. Snake kind of looks like a coiled piece of wire. If I was wrong and I said, oh, that's only a wire, and continued to walk, the chances are I could have been bitten if it was a real snake. Very early survival network. And by the way, survival responses towards snakes are in almost every culture. Even in places like Finland, where they don't have snakes, they've got 90 feet of permafrost year-round. But the brain doesn't distinguish physical, psychological danger. If it sees something that looks dangerous, it immediately channels into the amygdala, and you have a fear response, similar to the response I had with the snake. This is Paul MacLean, and Paul MacLean, after some 20 years or so of really, really good research, came up with a theory about the triune brain and published that theory in 1952. Before I even talk about the theory, let me just say this. Then in the 1950s, the greats of cognitive behavior therapy, people like Albert Ellis, people like Aaron Beck, were having some difficulty in establishing cognitive behavior therapy because psychodynamic therapists who kind of ruled the profession of psychotherapy claimed that there was no evidence for what they were talking about, mainly the relationship between thoughts and feelings. That these different parts of the brain were kind of more or less separate and discrete, and they then turned to the work of Paul MacLean. So what I'm going to do to explain this rather simple but really very elegant theory is this. I'm going to adapt or borrow from Dan Siegel and use his hand model. And in the hand model, this part of my hand is the reptilian brain, and this is the brainstem and the spinal cord. And in this reptilian brain, in this part of the brain, which is the lower part of the brain, one of the things it's responsible for, basic bodily functions, heart rate, breathing, body temperature, but it's also responsible for the fight or flight response for survival. So, fight, flight, fear, or any response to fear and threat comes out of this part of the brain. I'm walking along, I see this wire, I perceive it as whatever I perceive it as, and then these early survival systems begin to fire, mainly in the amygdala. And the amygdala is in a different part of the brain called the limbic system. So if you look at my thumb as the limbic system, and if you look at where my thumb is, so there's a really, really interesting connection between this part of my brain and this part of my brain. And the limbic system is also called the mammalian brain. It's concerned with emotions and emotional regulation. Apropos of our discussion, mainly work with the amygdala and with the fear circuits. Let me just give you an example of how these two parts of the brain kind of communicate. So I know everybody that's watching has at one point or another experienced the emotion of rage, really, really extreme anger. And that is where your heartbeat increases and your respiration increases and blood races to your arms and legs to fight or flee. And you can kill somebody, you're just so outraged. And that happens from the response being triggered here in the limbic system, and the limbic system communicating to this reptilian brain. Reptilian brain is also responsible, limbic system is also responsible for encoding traumatic memories through the hippocampus and short-term memories. And it's also tightly locked into communications with the prefrontal cortex here, which brings me to the next part of this hand model, which is my cortex. And this is the cortex here. It's the part of the brain that's has many, many functions, one of which is thinking. It's divided between the left and right hemisphere, and those hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum. So one of the basic tenets, of course, of cognitive behavior therapy is that the thinking brain, the prefrontal cortex, communicates with the limbic system really quickly, which communicates with the reptilian brain. And that's it's a fear response, it's very powerful, it's unconscious for the most part, and it's very fast, 1/20th of a second, which is what I like to say. So when somebody perceives a threat, whether the threat is psychological or whether the threat is physical, as soon as that threat is perceived, what happens is that fight or flight response is evoked. And again, it is evoked rather quickly, 1/20th of a second. But what I find amazing and what I find so interesting about our brain is this. Within that 1/20th of a second, it's not a very wide window. All of these things occur. So the up arrows are an increase of that function, and down arrows are a decrease of these functions. And the reason for that is obvious. What you need to survive is increased, and what you don't need to survive just uses up energy, gets in the way, and so that is decreased. It's unconscious, it's automatic, and it works really, really fast. It's just such an elegant system. It works really, really well. It does well because we need it to survive. If we remain in the context of a perceived threat without first relaxing our body, then we become sympathetic nervous system dominant. we experience anxiety, and very often for many of us, and I maintain you should kind of think about this, we engage in compulsive behaviors. One of the functions of compulsive, repetitive, ritualistic behaviors is actually to mitigate the feelings of anxiety. And once we do that, we're in better shape to control this sympathetic dominance. Of course, again, if you invoke relaxation first, then you don't have these other responses and you can become parasympathetically dominant. And that is a particularly important concept for you to do with your clients in therapy. If you're a therapist or if you're a mental health professional, it's always a good idea to begin a session with a little bit of relaxation. I'll show you a couple of techniques momentarily. This is one of my favorite people in the history of psychology. His name is Joseph Volpe, and Joseph Volpe was a South African psychiatrist, psychoanalyst. He worked with veterans of World War II, South African veterans of World War II, who had PTSD or whatever it was called in the early 1950s, with very, very poor success, and immediately came to realize that psychoanalysis was not the best intervention to use with people suffering from PTSD. He talked about it, he wrote about it, he researched it, and as a result, the South African Psychoanalytic Society essentially pushed him out of the country. They're bad, our good, because he then came to the U.S., settled in the U.S., and I like to call him the father of modern behavior therapy, or at least the father of American behavior therapy. We'll talk much more about some of his work in a later module. But here I just want to talk about the concept of reciprocal inhibition, which was developed by Joseph Volpe, which essentially is to keep your body relaxed in the presence of a perceived stressor. You can't feel symptoms, or you can't experience symptoms of traumatic stress in a relaxed body. If he did nothing else than this, and he has done considerably more than just this, I think he would have been a great psychotherapist, psychiatrist, but he's done some marvelous work. And this is one of my current clients. Her name is Lucy, and we've been working together for a while, trying to help her kind of increase her basic fee. But she, of course, is somewhat resistant. And of course, you know who this is. So if you kind of look at this picture and you smile, it shows a good sense of humor. If you kind of read this and you nod knowingly, it shows a high intellect. If you look at this and you see anything but a cigar, then I'm a therapist and we probably want to chat. Reciprocal inhibition is one of the concepts that I would like you to really consider thinking about, the whole notion of teaching relaxation, because I believe that it's essential to good trauma work. But sort of as a segue to that thought is also the use of, or the understanding of non-anxious presence, parasympathetic dominance, which is also a result of this reciprocal inhibition. We want to be in non-anxious presence with our clients in session because that creates the most optimally therapeutic environment. We do not want to be anxious, chronic, or otherwise. Even if we think we hide it, we don't. We communicate on many different levels, which is one of my beefs, that most of us in the profession do not experience our own psychotherapy. Something to think about. And then this is recent on the slide, because as I was doing this slide a couple of years ago, one of the participants mentioned a therapist she works with who actually does texting and her emails while she's working with clients. To me, that's way worse than anxiety. That's making the client a non-presence. I think that's very poor therapy, and I think it's probably a huge ethical violation. So we just ended Module 4, Part A, and we will then go to Part B, beginning with the core competency that deals with the ability to achieve, maintain, and teach relaxation and self-regulation. Thank you.